connecting to cloud server. Recording has started. Welcome to the KubeVirt community meeting on June 13th, 2018. I'm handing over to Stu Gott, speaking about the KVM changes.
Thanks, all. So yeah, the first agenda item here, using the device plugin framework to move dev KVM creation out of Virt launcher. The basic mission here is to reduce privileges needed by the Virt launcher pod, because creating a couple device nodes was really the only thing between privileged mode and not. It turned out we needed nothing else. So once we created a tunnel device and a KVM device using the device plugin framework, we could completely drop privileged mode from the pod itself. This is provided at the node level using Virt handler. Actually, we've integrated the device plugin right there into the original controller. So there's no new documentation impact in terms of getting it set up. There's no new nuances other than you see a capacity and an allocation or an allocatable settings within the node itself, noting that TUN and KVM devices are now available for use there.
Stu, so what if there are a couple of VMs running there? Wouldn't that be a problem, given that the KVM resource would be taken?
So in this particular case, it's a kind of a special case. The KVM resource is not taken in the sense that it's infinitely available. Same thing for the TUN device, actually. You can actually start multiple virtual machines and just use the same device node over and over again. This is special in terms of these two devices compared to, say, for instance, a GPU, where it is absolutely exclusive. The device plugin framework was originally designed around that, so I'm glad you brought that up, because there is the notion of allocated and the current capacity and how much is being used, and the device plugin framework is tracking that. In this case, we simply set the number of devices available to match the number of pods available, and we'll go from there, because you can use it as many times as you want over and over again.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question as well. Does this affect the versions of Kubernetes that we can support with KubeVirt?
Yep. Kubernetes 1.9 and earlier uses, this is an alpha feature, for so you have to enable a feature gate. It does work, and I did all my testing on 1.9 before realizing that we've actually got 1.10 already in master. So if you use 1.10, it does switch to beta mode, and we can actually use it without enabling a feature gate. But I think that I'm going to have to review that. There may be some version changes in terms of the API version that we're using, and so that probably will make this available in Kubernetes 1.10 and beyond, and not earlier.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I also wondered about the version. Actually, that needs to be noted in the user guides too, I guess. We have a small matrix there, what version we require, and that should see an update.
This is going to end up being a feature that's core to actually scheduling pods. It might gate the support for 1.9 and previous altogether if we do this.
That should be fine. Yeah, that should be fine. I think it has been embedded for a while, so if you use wants to use 1.9 and want to use 0.8 or whatever will be 0.7 of KubeVirt, then you need to open that feature gate. I think that's fair enough. They will gain a lot, because effectively then the launcher pod can run in unprivileged mode, which is reducing the attack surface quite a lot. So I think that's worth the effort. We should highlight that somewhere. Needs an update. Update of the user guide to reflect new min version for v07. 07, yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. Let me see. Is Peter here? No, Peter is not here. So, Alex, do you want to give an update on the? Actually, Alex and David, maybe you can give an update on the hooking interface.
Sure. So we had a proposal that landed last week. This kind of just described how we want to extend life cycle hooks into the startup flow. So the idea is we're going to use sidecar container, and people can define their hooks, and Virt launcher is going to call back into that sidecar container and allow people to inject their custom logic. So do things like modify the domain XML, potentially even modify things like libvirt config and config and anything that's involved with the life cycle once the VM has been scheduled. So where we're at now is we're actually defining that API. So we're talking about the gRPC proto buffer specification. So that's kind of where the discussion is at the moment. Hopefully we'll have that sorted fairly soon, and then we can just begin implementing this thing. So if people aren't familiar with the document that I'm talking about, I will go ahead and share that. If I can figure out how to do that in Zoom.
I think I got both in the minutes. So
You did? Okay.
I hope so.
So any questions about what's going on here? Anything we should discuss or hash out during our architecture meeting here?
So one note just, I think it's important to note that currently we have the limitation that the sidecar container will not be able to connect the network because of the implementation of how networking is done. But that should only be a temporary issue, as Sebastian is working on solving that, and we'll get to that later on.
Yeah, and the only thing I want to add is that
you're a little bit low on volume.
Oh, sorry. One sec. Hello. Let's see.
Maybe we can just listen very, very carefully.
Yeah. Is it better now? I'll try to speak loudly.
It is better.
Okay. The only thing I would add is that I think it's worth to maybe consider a typed API as opposed to a string API. To some extent, then the typed API would define, even if it's just a straight XML schema, in that we already have the serialization in the Virt launcher API, and it already has XML serialization code. So I think it might be a good idea to expose that as a fully typed API rather than just a byte array. That's my only comment on that. But other than that, it looks good, and I like the design. Works for us.
So yeah, one note on that. I mean, Peter actually brought that up. So the issue is that if we go with a typed API, then we would have to recreate all types we currently have in Go only to represent them in protobuf. So that's the issue. If we have an automated way to do that, it would be easier, but I'm not aware of a reliable way to do that.
Makes sense.
But as said, I think we start with that API. It would be really cool to see that the flow in general works. And because I have the same concern, typed API would be nice, but let's start and then let's see how we can improve it gracefully.
Makes sense.
Cool. So let me take the node. Our node was discussed. The issue is that protobuf does not. Is that we have to recreate all types in protobuf. Yeah. Okay. And the same is, by the way, true for the XML, because if we pass the VM YAML and the XML, then we'd have to create all of those entities. So I see the shortcomings. Let's see, maybe we find a good solution.
The XML is going to be more complicated. I don't even know what we expose in our XML code for the domain XML. I'm not even sure that fully represents the Virt.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, but status node. Oh, we had status, right? Current state is getting finalized. Should be ready to be implemented soon. I try to make the key sentence bold, then it's easier to read. Okay, thank you.
Regarding the protobuf, I just wanted to add that at the end we will probably need it anyway.
What exactly?
Protobuf on all types, independent of anything as we call API. But I'm not sure if when and if that will come to CRDs. I mean, for aggregated API service, it's possible. I don't know.
Oh. So first, it's a fun fact that we saw 3 children on this call already, which is fun. Second, exactly, Yuval. The second thing is, actually, that's true. With CRDs, we might have a generic mechanism to generate protobuf files. So let's see how that goes forward. Good, thanks for that note, Roman. Then I would move on with 18 minutes into the hour. Roman, maybe you can share a few notes on the VM entity renames.
Yeah, sure. As a follow-up of the discussions on the mailing lists regarding to renaming offline virtual machine to stateful virtual machine, we at the end ended with renaming virtual machine to virtual machine instance and offline virtual machine to virtual machine. That probably implies, although it's not yet finalized, that the new virtual machine will be less seen as a controller as it was until now, and it will be probably more like a workload type again. There are probably, so we broke the API for that, although it's a pure rename, and we probably have to break it again when we move forward with that. As a consequence, the pull request which we merged also increased the API version of all objects from v1 alpha 1 to v1 alpha 2.
Okay, thanks for such a large change. Few words. Any questions on that one? All right.
Well, one thing, no, not really a question. I just wanted to point out the reason we're able to have this kind of flexibility is because of our functional and unit tests. So this is like just a very important note that you can pull this kind of thing off because we can verify it later on. And this is why we are harping on unit and functional tests so much.
Very true.
Yeah, very true. Tests we can verify afterwards. Yeah, very, very true. Actually, good that we don't give CI its own section here, because then we need 2 hours, I guess. CI is so time consuming, but still so important. Okay, then moving on to the network API section by Vladik and Ihar. Maybe you can give an update what happened there.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Harry, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I can present everything. So we have this document in the Google Docs. So the first bits of it were implemented by Vladik and are already merged, which adds basically adds interfaces and networks as proper attributes. It doesn't implement all the things, but it just adds support for those attributes and just a single interface. Yeah, interface network type pod, which is pod. We don't have anything but that yet. But the API is merged. There are lots of places in the code where we still assume either that the interface is single or that it is the first in the list, or that it is necessarily a pod network backed interface. So all those assumptions should go away. I have a PR to do just that. I think it's ready for review. There were already several iterations. It's currently not in the mergeable state because I think because of the VM rename, because it triggered all the Git conflicts. So I need to get back to the patch and rebase it properly. But other than that, I think it should be good to go. The problem with the PR is, since it doesn't really add anything user visible, because we don't have support for other network types yet, it's just like it's covered with unit tests and just common sense. Yeah, we will need to land it without proving that it works end to end in some way with an integration test. But the unit test should be good enough, and at least we can validate that there are no regressions with existing functional tests. And so review is welcome there. And on the note of the tests, the initial PR that added the basic API changes, it didn't include any integration tests. So I also have a PR on review that adds a small one to validate that both implicit and explicit interface definitions work the same way, that you can interconnect with the VMs and all this stuff. So there's ongoing work. Yeah, and reviews welcome.
Sebastian cannot attend, but I had a chat with him today. I think what would really flush out any issues with the design or anything is the fact that he's adding a new front end. So once you have two types of something, then you can be sure that you didn't forget to, some shortcut or anything with your interface design that is not good for something more abstract. So I think once he's going to deliver, this would really flush out the design, as he's adding an additional front end.
Could be. The question is whether we need to wait for that. Like, it's chicken and egg in a way. You can't validate multiple types.
What I'm saying is that when you try to abstract based on one example, there are chances you get it wrong. Once you get the example, then you might need to have another iteration over the design to get it right. Maybe, I don't know. Let's see what he does lands and see if we need to reiterate on the interface design.
I just wanted to highlight that I think he's implementing another backend, right? Because the front end is only the interfaces to the VM, and his mode, the slurp mode, is effectively. Oh, it's actually not an interface.
It's a new connection. Yeah, it's a new connection between front end and back end, right? So the back end is still going to be pod network, and the connection is going to be different. So this would really, I think, would flush out things, because it is slightly different. I mean, when we get a entirely new backend, like not a pod network, but something else, then this would be even better. But I mean, for now, I think what he's trying to do would kind of see if the abstraction is done at the correct point.
Yeah. Also, another thing to point out is that his work is very different from the rest of the interfaces that will be added. His interface doesn't rely on KubeVirt, and the configuration is a bit different. There is nothing to prepare on the host, and it's just like a fact gathering and preparing the QEMU command, rather than looking at the other types of interfaces where you would have a completely different set of things that you would need to do in order to configure the interface. So in this sense, Slurp is very, very different.
Yeah, but this is good for the overall design. So if he's doing something that is very different, then it would force us to put the abstraction at the right point, or at the right level.
Yeah, there's during the review, there was one change that we can agree to do, but overall the design didn't change really.
So I just would like to get us on track. So before we heard a lot about Sebastian's work. Before we go there fully and tell people what it is about, maybe there are some fun notes on the base networking API. I mean, we heard that the interfaces might need adjustment. That's totally fine in order to reflect the ongoing work for additional backends and additional connection methods. But right now, on the base networking API, is there anything else?
No, the only thing is that there was an attempt to some kind of a structurize how new devices will be added, how new backends and new interfaces should be added where, and just to lay out the logic of how does this set up.
That would make sense, because I expect that we at least have a few backends for the moment, at least, to play with them and connection methods. Okay, yeah, thanks, Stu. So I think the gist is, and that's really cool, the foundation was laid to support multiple interfaces and multiple backends. I mean, that's even beyond what Kubernetes can do, even though we're pushing there as well the boundaries to see that we get that supporting Kubernetes. But yeah, it's cool. So that effectively directly brings us over, well, not so much, but a little bit to Sebastian's work of working on Slurp networking. Sebastian couldn't be here today. Yuval, do you want to give an intro what he's working on and specifically the goal, why he's doing that, and why we went with Slurp, even if it's so controversial?
Okay. We need a way to be able not to use delegate IP and still have the pod keep its own IP. So, for example, any sidecar that has to have an IP would be able to work. In addition, there are networking specific sidecar like Istio and Linkerd and others that actually want to monitor or take care of the all kind of things with the networking towards the actual process running inside the pod, and for them, they need the process to run inside the pod. One option would be to go and implement an L4 proxy, TCP and UDP, that runs inside the pod and proxies the information towards the VM. The problem there is that even though we perceive the VM as something internal to the pod, from networking perspective, the VM is something external to the pod. So for that to work with any IP table rules that may be installed by sidecars, for example, by Istio, for that to work properly, we had to put our own IP table rules, and then it could become a bit problematic because it depends on how well or how nicely the IP table rules of the of the sidecar play with others. So if they don't play nicely, then things won't work and break. And for that, the only option would be, if we want to avoid IP table rules completely, the only option would be that the VM network is not coming as a real network bridge interface from the outside. It's really coming from the process, and this is the only option, is that the QMO itself would be the networking stack of the VM, and this would be using Slurp. So it pretty much supports TCP and UDP out of the box. It does require a little bit of configuration to use to support ICMP, but it also works. We haven't even looked at stability and performance, but from functional perspective, Sebastian proved that it just works, both for the ingress and egress traffic.
Yeah, actually, Sebastian provided, and I'll add the link to the minutes document, an extensive document of explaining that in complete depth. So thanks to Yuval for explaining that. And we'll see that we find the Berlin blog post of Sebastian. And I think that's it. I'm adding that to the document right now. Yeah, so yes, so Slurp is really to unblock, but we'll continue to research how we can get away from Slurp again, because it's unsafe, untested, and so on. But there are options, but we want to unblock further work. Okay. 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 Cool. Any questions on Slurp or the goal we try to achieve there? Okay. Actually, maybe while we can add that, if we can do that quick, we are good on time. Maybe you can add a few words on your approach, actually, because you effectively researched the second branch of networking we're looking at.
Yeah, I haven't really got to the networking part of it. I'm just played around with device plugins. I just wanted to see how the mechanism works and what it does exactly. So I wrote a device plugin for the simplest thing I could come up with, which is a random number generator. But this is just to make things work. Using device plugins for networking is actually not that straightforward, because the idea behind device plugins is whatever exists under /dev, and the network itself is not there, so you need to do all kind of things to expose that as devices, as PCI devices, to the pod, which is fine. But I mean, it's not the natural way that networking maybe should have been exposed to the pod.
Okay, yeah, so it's still early research, but yeah, the API is ready, and we'll speak to you next week and the week after to see where we stand.
Okay.
Okay, so Yuval, can you maybe add a few notes to that section, because I missed to take notes while you were speaking?
Sure.
Thanks. Okay, then going over to huge pages by Artyom, because we also want to improve the performance side.
So the PR is ready, and I tested it on huge pages with 2 megabytes and 1 gigabyte, because it's the architecture that I have currently, and it worked fine. So maybe just some tips about validation. It has some limitations that for example, you need to specify memory divisible by huge page size, and also in the case, and you cannot specify less memory than huge page size. For example, you cannot specify 1012 megabytes if you want to use 1 gigabyte huge pages, because it's just irrelevant. Anyway, it will just catch. It will take 1 gigabyte of memory. So, and that's all.
Actually said do we do the checks actually in the code now? So you said, that's divisible by 2 and...
Yeah. I added the validation checks, and it must catch all test cases. Again, I added unit test, I added functional test, all here, all under PR.
Ready. Okay. Are divisible by 2 and huge page larger equal memory requested memory size. So one note here actually is, oh well, I'm not sure if it's worth a note, but I don't know, we would lose ourselves in details. The API of how huge pages are used so far, I mean, as a small note, the API of how huge pages are used is a little bit different to how we specified on pods, but we think that's good. Actually, we should probably note that maybe in a design doc. Artyom, do you have a design document somewhere?
Not really, only some upstream discussion and discussion under pull request.
Yeah, I wonder if it's worth to capture at least Yeah, never mind. It's good. So API is a little bit different.
Yeah, I believe next time when I will write API, I will create some design document, at least some initial design document. That we will have time for discussion.
Yeah, it's not only about capturing that, it's really about, I mean, the rationale why we did it. I think that's important to capture, but we can take that offline. Cool. On the same side, so thank you, Artem, for that update, and good to see that's progressed so far. Actually, it's crazy. I wonder how long did it take huge pages to land in OpenStack, and how long did it take it to land in KubeVirt? Crazy.
Yeah, in OpenStack, it's a completely different approach, and we needed to change scheduling. We needed to do a lot of things. So don't compare.
OSP 8, I remember well.
Yeah, we have schedule awareness out of the box here, right? Because Kubernetes did it for us. Okay, Vladik, can you tell us, it's on the same page, performance. Can you tell us a little bit more about your CPU manager research?
Yeah, I just briefly started looking at how the CPU manager works for Kubernetes and what can we do to tap into this and use the scheduled scheduled CPUs and pin to those. So I'm working on a POC to show that.
Okay, yeah, that's brief. Maybe you can.
Vladik, is there a design doc for that? I'm interested in learning.
Yeah, maybe next week, but not yet.
Yeah, actually, I was about to say that once you have done your research, could you please send out an email to outline what you learned and how you envision the integration into KubeVirt, including an API or design document?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. Okay, then we come to, let me see, does it make sense to put something else in that section? No, I think that's it. Then we can jump a little bit to a different topic, which is storage, CDI, which we can expand.
Hey, I guess that's me. So I introduced a new custom resource definition into the CDI project. And if people aren't familiar with CDI yet, it's the Containerized Data Importer project. So it's doing the process of taking a data source, whether it be something HTTP or an S3 bucket or something like that, and pulling that down and placing it within a persistent volume claim. So now we have a custom resource definition called data volume that's orchestrating that whole process. So it's an object that defines, it's a really, really simple spec. It defines the source of the import, and then it has a PVC spec underneath it that lets you say, I want to create this PVC and inject this source into it. So that's all we have right now, and it orchestrates all that. And you can see in the status section, it's going to go through creating PVC, scheduling the import in progress, import completed or failed or whatever. And this gives us a well-defined API for orchestrating this process that something like KubeVirt can actually consume. So the next step for us is we would like to see KubeVirt integrate this data volume CRD as a volume source. And we can do all kinds of really neat things with that once we take that approach, because we can say things like we want to define the data volume within the KubeVirt spec potentially, or we can post a data volume spec and a VM spec that consumes it immediately and be ensured that the virtual machine controller will know to wait for that data volume to complete before it tries to attach the PVC to the virtual machine. So that's what we're looking at. Does anyone have any questions about how we plan on interacting with CDI or this object or what we're trying to do?
Sure. Question. In terms of the different possibilities for using imports, will we be able to use a URL?
Yes. So that's the first thing that's already done. So HTTP import. So you can describe the source as an HTTP source, put the URL in it, and one of our test cases right now is just pull in like the CROS, CROS, whatever, however it's pronounced, image directly into a PVC, and we just put the URL for the upstream, like where it's downloadable in the spec, and it'll work.
Cool, thanks.
Other sources we're considering that I think are interesting are being able to clone a persistent volume claim. So a source being another persistent volume claim. Another source that I think is interesting is a container. So we could say the disk or the data exists in this container, stream this container into a PVC. So there's lots of interesting options for us here.
Oh, I was not muted. I'm curious to see how it behaves. So I do have some, wouldn't say concerns, but I wonder because it looks so much like, rather like a process to import something, and then it's not declarative because after you imported it, you assigned it. So I wonder how that fits, but let's see. All in all, really, really cool work. One question, pretty technical, is I looked at the YAML, and I saw that you use spec PVC. And I wonder if you want to do it, call it a template section, PVC template or something like that, just to align more with how Kubernetes is handling templates for entities.
Possibly. I'll have to think about that. So it's kind of limited. It's only the spec of the PVC, not the PVC object itself. So you can't describe metadata or labels or anything like that. And this is actually going to be an optional field in the future as well, where what we want to see is the importer project have the ability to detect the size of the import that's about to occur, and it can dynamically create the PVC in response to that with the correct resource limits. So in the future, we see potential where people don't even have to specify the PVC, or they can specify a partial PVC, which would just declare something like the storage class, or if they wanted a limit that was higher than the actual data that was being imported, they could specify that as well.
David, how do you envision integrating this work with the templates? Like, so I could say, store this VM with this specs, like CPU, two CPUs, 1 gig of RAM or whatever. And I want the source of the VM to be this HTTP URL. But then that HTTP URL is a template of the VM template.
Funny that you bring that up, because I think that's effective. It sounds like an OVA import, right? I mean, the metadata, the definition of the VM, including the disk, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't quite follow it. I didn't quite follow that, Alex. I'm sorry.
So your work is basically allows in the VM.yaml to define a template, right? That says like, this is going to be the disk with this HTTP URL, and then it's going to download, let's say, the virtual machine QCOW2 image into that PVC volume claim. And what I'm saying is, how does that play with the VM templates that KubeVirt has, where I could predefine a template to have VM with 2 CPUs and 1 gig of RAM, and this, but I also want to define like the QCOW2 image. So it's kind of like a nested template, and we can take it offline if you want.
I see what you're saying.
There's actually another project out there called Virt V2V that's under KubeVirt as well, and that's more target there because it sounds like your source is another virtual machine, and you want to import pieces of that into this new deployment. Is that correct?
No, it's more of like a nested template as I see it, I think.
It is, and it would work probably exactly the way you'd think it would work. So you're going to have a unique, if for example, we define the data volume spec within a VM or a VM template, that's going to be unique to the instance that started as a result of that, if that makes sense. So you're going to get stamped out a new PVC for every virtual machine instance that's created as a result of that.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I think, I mean, this was discussed offline quite a bit. Adam, maybe, and David, maybe it's good to actually bring that up on the KubeVirt dev mailing list because it ties so much into it. And maybe it's good to give an early heads up before we speak about the integration to KubeVirt, just to give all of us the ability to look into that.
Sure. So that's something that I'm going to be focusing on soon. So I'll go ahead and write a very brief description of what I'm planning and how the integrations, I think the integration is going to work, and we can start that discussion.
Cool. Thanks. Any more questions?
I have one question. Do we plan to include this stuff, let's say CDI, as an artifact deployed during the release? Like, for instance, the same thing that we do when we release a new version of KubeVirt, include it so that end users understand it like a real dependency of the project.
It's not going to be a dependency of the project. So KubeVirt should be able to work without CDI. For you to consume data volumes, you will need CDI. And I think that it would be, CDI right now is under the KubeVirt organization, but it's decoupled in that they're separate projects. I think it does make sense to potentially consider syncing the release cycles, though. And that's something that we'll need to discuss.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what we try to follow is still the mix and matching with KubeVirt. I mean, KubeVirt primarily relies on the native entities of Kubernetes. And I think it's good if we follow that and don't create a huge dependency to read right now. I mean, you could call it a product then if we did so. But we're a project. Cool. Karim, as you spoke up, do you want to let us know what you do about GKE and AWS? I saw a PR somewhere related to that.
Yes, I can make a small introduction. It's not a big deal anyway, I guess. But basically, the idea is to allow end users to quickly test or develop actually on top of KubeVirt by not having to install it by themselves. Instead, we want them to be able to deploy it on either Google Cloud Platform, that's what I've been working on, or on AWS, and that's what Richard Su has been working on. So in both cases, we are using Packer as a way to quickly create an image from which a user can easily deploy an instance with KubeVirt being deployed. Originally, what I was doing was actually putting all the KubeVirt stuff directly into the image and then forcing the user to use a given host name and IP actually to prevent issues with certificates and things like that. But actually, I followed more or less Richard's approach, which is basically to include startup scripts in its image and then have the instance deploying KubeVirt directly on first launch, because this way we don't rely on specific host name or IP. And at the end, you know, the instance is still ready within 5 minutes. So I guess it's an acceptable time. So basically, we will more or less demo it tomorrow in the sprint demo. And that's it, I guess. And yeah, also, I believe that we want to think a little bit as next steps in what we want to include into the image. For instance, that's the reason why I was asking about CDI, or maybe we want to use this host path provisioner that I saw some work being done, or things like that as next steps.
Are you publishing the Packer IO generated image, like publicly?
Yes, that's the reason why we didn't share so far, because in Google Cloud Platform, I'm having issues with my account to be able to actually make it public. But of course, that's the idea. And what we also want to do is to more or less follow the release and have using like an internal CI process so that each release generates a new image with the corresponding release version, let's say.
How's this image being advertised? As a kind of a playground for people who want to just gain experience? Okay.
Not more than that. And it will be published like in KubeVirt.io webpage, with the idea of doing the same that they do at Ansible or ManageIQ, where you are like in the front page, just a link saying want to try it, just click the button. You have a set of instructions, and it's quite easy to get started. But again, it's just more for easy testing, basically, without having to install anything.
Yeah, that's great. That seems
Nice.
very useful.
Nice.
It is. Finally can run KubeVirt alongside routines. Cool. Thank you. Looking forward to that that single button push trial.
You will have it.
Oh, eventually. All right. Handing over to Mark, who has been working on something not so technical. Oh well, on the other end it was, right? Just not code.
Yeah, well, we can discuss it if it's technical or not. However, the story was that on the Kubernetes Slack in a German-speaking channel, the editor of a German developer magazine, and it's literally translated, Entwickler Magazin, asked for some articles for the next issue of that magazine, which will be about Kubernetes. And so I thought, oh, well, it might be an idea to write something about KubeVirt. And I suggested that to Fabian, and he immediately said, okay, go on. And yeah, so I wrote something about it. And at the beginning of this week, I sent the first version for review to the editor. And yeah, unfortunately, I cannot share it publicly, I think, because yeah, the magazine now has some kind of rights on it. But if someone, at least from Red Hat, wants to review it, yeah, just contact me. But it's in German. When it's published, I'm not 100% sure, but the editor said something that it might be also published on a German-speaking website, jackcenter.de, and maybe also in English on jackcenter.com. But I'm not sure yet how that will work. Yeah, that's funny. That's it.
Cool, thank you. That's a cool opportunity. Let's see when it pops up, and then we can do a literal English translation.
Yeah. Well, the date when the magazine will be published is planned for August 8th, so we need to wait a bit.
Perfect. Every non-German speaker will get a German copy. Cool. All right. We went through all the major topics. There are now two smaller ones, or one small one from my side. Some cool conferences are coming up. Conferences are all over the year, but I want to highlight two because the CFPs are open. That's KubeCon North America, which is taking place in Seattle again this year. I encourage everybody to submit stuff there. I think we do so much work also in depth in Kubernetes, like the device plugin work, where we research networking, and how we leverage huge pages, and how we leverage, huge pages and the CPU manager stuff together. I think that is what we can speak about at KubeCon, because what we've seen is that KubeCon is specifically focused about solving problems and also speaking about problems. They're not so much about technical stuff, that's in the breakout sessions, but the bigger talks are really about solving problems and use cases. So also for you, Alex, which are pretty much on the front of solving use cases, that's also something you can think about to speak about that. Yeah. KVM forum on the other end is a little bit different, beast. It's more technical, and there are much more technical articles. It's still something where if you're in Europe, you might want to submit something. The CFP is closing soon, effectively tomorrow. So consider it if you want to do something in the KubeVirt scope there. In the past, they accepted talks about KubeVirt, so maybe they will do it again. Everything what we do is, I think, all of you looking here at the screen at videos or not videos is applicable there, as far as I can tell. Cool. To submit some talks. I can just encourage everybody. Cool. That's it from my side. We are on time, 4 minutes left. Anybody has something he wants to bring up? Questions beyond the topics of the meeting today? All right, going once. I would go 3 times, and then the meeting is over. So going once, twice, and the third time. Then I thank everybody for attendance and wish a good day, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.